everyone, and welcome to the Health Go Live webinar series. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Clarify Health. Just a few housekeeping items to go over. We would like to remind everyone that the Q&A feature will be available, so feel free to send in those questions for the panelists throughout the discussion and we will work those in. Afterwards, stay on to watch a cooking demonstration with Jennifer Clare, owner of Home Cooking New York, who will show us a crowd-pleasing pasta dish. And with that, I'll throw it over to our moderator, Manisha Gulati, Chief Operating Officer at Clarify Health. Manisha oversees Clarify's product teams, the commercialization strategy, and sales enablement across all customer segments, and the company's implementation and customer success teams. Thanks for joining us, Manisha.
Thank you for having us. I'm very excited to be here today with our amazing panelists to talk about launches for new therapies. So the revenue performance of a pharmaceutical drug at launch sets the stage for its commercial future. The first year is usually make or break. However, the majority of new drugs fall short of first-year sales expectations. Over the course of the hour, we'll highlight key themes impacting launches today and tease out what it will take to beat these odds. So I'll start by introducing our panelists. I'm excited to have Bosch Parasuraman, Surya Singh, and Callum McRae with us today. Bosch is the Vice President of the Patient and Health Impact Group in the Rare Disease Business Unit at Pfizer. She leads the teams focused on evidence generation, pricing, and market access. For the last 20 years, she's held a variety of leadership positions at Pfizer and AstraZeneca, overseeing market access and health outcomes globally and regionally across several therapeutic areas. She has a PhD in pharmacy administration. Surya is president of the advisory firm Singh Healthcare. He's an adjunct instructor of medicine at Harvard Med School and a practicing physician. He was the chief medical officer at CVS Health for 7 years. So he's been on the plan and procurement side of drug launch. And he's also a senior advisor to ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. So it'll be great to get his views on health technology assessment and their role in launch. Callum is a professor of medicine at Harvard Med School, vice chair for translational innovation at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, an associate member of the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, and a practicing physician. He is the founder and director of One Brave Idea. It's a research institute focused on uncovering the causes of heart disease. He's also the principal investigator of the Apple Heart and Movement Study. So thank you everyone for being here. Let's start by taking stock of the drug launch ecosystem and the incentives of different stakeholders that we see. So I'll start with Callum. What is the biggest difference you're seeing between drug launches today and 5 years ago? Callum, you just want to unmute yourself.
Hi, Manisha. Sorry.
Oh,
I think
so. Callum, we're just starting with the poll. So we're asking folks in the audience what type of institution you currently work in, so that we can get a feel for where the audience is. So if those of you in the audience can let us know what kind of company you work for, that'll help the panelists frame the answers today. And we're going to see the results of that poll. Okay, so we have about a third of the audience that's from a pharma or biotech company, but we have a good mix throughout, different people from the provider and health system side, from payers, and from health tech as well. So that's good because we're going to be talking about data quite a bit. So now, Callum, I will turn it to you to think about what are the biggest differences you're seeing from a drug launch perspective.
Yeah, I think, Manisha, the areas that we see changing really quite dramatically are an increasing recognition that implementation and implementation science have to be really introduced much earlier in the drug development process and be a constant part of that tail end of the clinical trial all the way into the initial drug launch. I think the other two areas that we're seeing develop fairly quickly are segmentation in the market. I think many drugs are now being introduced in very much more precise areas of the population rather than broad general deployments. And that also obviously feeds back into less expensive primary clinical trials or pivotal phase 3 trials. And then the final recognition, I think, is that all of this has to be fueled by much more granular data that informs all of the process. And I think that's really the piece that technological advances and novel analytic insights are beginning to deliver on in the last 3 to 4 years.
And, you talked a little bit about segmentation in the market. We're seeing, the number of drugs approved by the FDA has gone up, from 23 to 38 per year in the last, 5-6 years compared to the decade before, but the revenue per drug is going down. How much do you think that relates to, the specialty and the segmentation in the market that you're seeing?
Well, I think, a lot of this is a function of the life cycle of the drug. I think what has tended to happen is there's usually, because of the segmentation, fairly high pricing early, but there's still essentially a 12 to 15 year implementation equilibrium development. And so the rate at which drugs actually end up getting into the patient populations that could benefit from those drugs has not really changed. And I think, to be completely frank, that balance between pricing and implementation is still very poorly measured and managed. And so I think, again, here, another area where data and insights can really begin to deliver on getting the right drugs to the right patients at the right time on a very much more abrupt timeline than has traditionally been the case.
Okay, and Basha, what are you seeing from the Pfizer perspective?
I agree with Callum. I think the marketplace is changing rapidly, and these days, clinical data alone that was meant to get regulatory approvals, even as much as 2 to 3 years ago, that's not enough, and that's not going to be a successful launch strategy for any biotech company that's planning to launch in the current environment and future environment. It's equally important to understand whether or not patients can afford our medicine, especially in the United States. There are copay burdens, there's co-insurance burdens. Patients are becoming decision makers. What's the access model? How are they changing? And how are payers deeming products to be cost effective or valuable? What are the disease areas they're willing to invest in? What's a priority to them? And those changes are dynamic, they're happening now, and that's changing the communication that's happening in the pricing and market access area. And the same is true for patients. we've done in the past a good job in implementing patient-reported outcomes and tools in clinical trials. Those have oftentimes been just off-the-shelf type of instruments. Sometimes we develop our own, but we need to understand the patient journey through data, through conversations, include them in the clinical trial design so that their perspectives are brought in, and then their endpoints, appropriate endpoints are collected, and those insights really help in our discussion with the payers. So at Pfizer specifically, the role of access and affordability, that begins very early in the development of drug development, and that's part of our decision-making and governance process now, because that's the only way we can help to prioritize our portfolio and bring medicines that will actually help to provide, that will help with the access conundrum that's facing the patients and societies.
So you both have brought up data and how it's being used. You brought up affordability. So what does that mean for the patient and the payer? And you've also brought up engaging the patients in a different way. So one of the things that makes it difficult to launch in this environment is that many of those different stakeholders have different incentives and different points of view about what they're looking for and what they need. So, Surya, I'd be curious, when you think about a launch today, juggling the needs of those multiple stakeholders, payer, regulator, physician, patient, is there a growing misalignment between these stakeholders relative to adopting a new therapy?
Yeah, I think there's misalignment. I am optimistic, I guess, about us finding ways in order to decrease the misalignment rather than allowing it to be perpetuated. And I see signs of that. I'm, again, optimistic but realistic. There's a bunch of different examples to cite, and I'll tick through a couple, but of where misalignment basically continues. And the blunted uptake at the time that the drug launches is really a result almost directly of misalignment and many of the issues that Raj and Callum just brought up. it's both the, sort of single source of truth from a data perspective, trusting the analyses that have been done. And then, from the payer perspective, a lot of it does boil down to whether or not the price is in accordance with the demonstrated value at the time that the drug is launched. So, again, just to use a couple examples, because all of those stakeholders, you can take any two or any three of them and find examples of misalignment. But when you bring regulators into the mix, as an example, the gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy that was launched last year, Zolgensma, was a good example where regulators, sort of allowed the label to be established or approved it with a label that was broader than the evidence that most payers were really comfortable with or felt like had been well established. So you had both providers and you had payers saying, it doesn't seem that the evidence follows with where the label allows this drug to be administered to patients. There was misalignment just from the get-go on who should get the drug, which, is before we even talk about what the reimbursement should be, which was happening simultaneously. CAR T therapies, which obviously have been on the market now for a few years. In that example, there were a few things done to try to increase alignment, including outcomes-based contracts, especially one that was very highly visible with CMS, and announced at the time that one of them was launched to the market. But one of the issues has been that the payment, to Calum's point about the implementation science, the payment structure has been lagging basically, how the treatment is administered. And now a lot of people are thinking, well, off-the-shelf CAR T, allogeneic CAR T may solve some of those problems because it'll be given in the outpatient setting, and we can certainly drill down on that later in the conversation. But my point in bringing it up is, again, it's a misalignment in that case between three parties: the life sciences company, the provider, who you talk to any health system says to date they have not been made whole on virtually any CAR T patients, and then from the payer perspective, this commercial payers specifically, is very sort of lagging and haphazard approach to payment. So I'll stop there. There are other examples, but yeah, I mean, I think there just to end it with the optimistic viewpoint, there are spotty examples where we see increasing alignment rather than misalignment. And so I want to make sure that we get to talk about some of those also.
Yeah, we definitely will. Listening to that, Bosch, in terms of the differing provider, payer, patient, stakeholder perspectives, how is pharma thinking about it? Where do pharma's incentives differ and make it difficult for them to actually match the expectations of various ecosystem stakeholders going forward?
Yeah, I think the industry overall, both the pharma industry and the payer industry, are still in the process of aligning on what's value, what's the definition of value. And value is still very broad. Value could be economic, value could be the comparative effectiveness, longer term data value. Definitely a lot of the value comes from the voice of the patient, the data from the patient. So we need to really work much closer with payers and co-create either payment models or performance guarantee type of structures with a sense of trust, with a sense of common understanding of how we're going to capture value, how we're going to measure value, how we're going to track outcomes. And until those systems are in place and co-created, it's still going to be a process of piloting and testing. And Suriani gave a couple of examples. And I think as more curative therapies come to the market, there's probably an opportunity there to kind of come together and co-create those solutions. It's important that while we look at just patient outcomes, we also need to look at the total cost of care. So there's a lot of inefficiencies and wastage that happens, and often those don't get factored into the value equation. So having the infrastructure, the data systems in place, which is lacking, becomes a barrier in creation of the value. And as we see science and innovations that are outpacing our policy systems and reimbursement models, we are finding ourselves still in situations where drug costs our medicine costs become a topic of discussion. We talk about value much later before we talk about price, and we need to first talk about value before we get into price. And one example that I want to kind of give is, a Pfizer and a BMS example is the NOAC category. When they came out, there was no real head-to-head data between one NOAC and another. Each of those products had done clinical trials versus warfarin, and they'd shown that NOACs overall prevented strokes better, reduced major bleeds. But from a payer perspective, these were highly expensive medicines still. And therefore, real-world data actually became a great platform to kind of show the comparative effectiveness of these products. And as a result, Pfizer and BMS now have entered several outcomes-based agreements that are actually measuring the value of Eliquis versus other anticoagulants on the bleed rates. And that's really helped payers to evaluate how NOACs are performing in the real world. That's helping in a product placements and formularies. So this is an example from, I would say, this past decade. I think there's got to be much more to be done, as gene and cell therapies come to the market.
So for you, that's a successful example of where payers and life science were able to work together and use data to really look at value.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Callum, what examples have you seen that have been either successful or not so successful recently?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of quite pertinent examples. I mean, one of the classic mismatches that we've seen in the last few years is PCSK9 inhibitors, where really this sense that it was a fire and forget type model where you did the trials, there was efficacy, there was clear safety data, but the pricing structure was such, it was just left hanging for so many years and still no real implementation before the next cycle of drugs reached the market. And so I think thinking about it exactly as Bash said, not so much as a series of events, but as a co-creation, a collaborative effort that is really a process that continues from the initial inception of the drug program right the way through to its final sort of set of phase 4 niche identification. That's really how I think the future has to evolve. Another couple of examples where I think people were more successful was just even simply Entresto with Novartis, where I think pricing and even the label that suggested that, in fact didn't suggest, it mandated that you had to have been stable for 6 weeks before the drug could be tested, left a lot of people as outpatients with nobody really willing to introduce a drug that actually has been shown to be really effective in many instances. And so by doing another trial, which they were forced to do in this setting, in an inpatient setting, they were able then to more effectively deploy the drug. But again, that's something that in a free-flowing information context with the right framework could have evolved all the way through the drug development process. And I think that's become increasingly recognized as the sort of rate-limiting step is how do you get a framework in which the information, everybody's sharing the same information and can begin to essentially equilibrate around a common reality, a shared reality.
So, all of you have mentioned examples so far of therapies that requires also some sort of physician intervention or a provider to be able to administer it. And there's actually a question that's come up in the audience when you think about physician-administered biosimilar products. What are the bigger differences that you see in the launch process or, payer and prescriber engagement? So I guess it brings up the question of if you're thinking about a biosimilar versus or a generic versus an innovative therapy, what are the differences that you're seeing, and does that change the path forward? And Callum, would you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always still, even with many of the biosimilars, there's less, a lower threshold certainly for proof of concept and proof of safety and outcomes, but there's still, I think, an element of reticence on behalf of the community to really think about how you get a drug into common practice without having it tested in a randomized setting. I think what we're beginning to see is that the real world context and the ability to introduce new biosimilars or very similar class members, the threshold can be significantly lowered. The costs of doing that can be substantially mitigated by thinking about real world context where the system of implementation is actually also the system of regulatory approval. And I think, again, it's really just a function of the level of data captured and the process of randomization. And I think we're beginning to see that evolve in real time so that many of the drug trials of the future, I think, will have a very different, more adaptive rollout strategy than the current serial pivotal phase 3, then into a sort of almost an implementation battle over a period of, as I said, sometimes 12 to 15 years. I think you're going to see things evolving much more in a dynamic basis, a better measurement leads to better management of the problem. And I think you're going to see pharma, biotech, payers, and providers all collaborating with regulators in a very different way going forward.
Great, and so we'll dive into a couple of these themes. Let's start with data, because we're talking about data and trials and real-world data. We'd like to ask the audience to start out with, as we dive into this theme, are the pharma and biotech industries doing enough to incorporate real-world data into their launches? So, do you think they haven't stepped up enough, not enough is being done? Are they on their way, but there's still a big gap, so they're doing the best they can given the circumstances? Or you think, you know what, actually pharma and biotech is doing the best they can. It's now trying to figure out how do you align the rest of the incentives and pricing models and other areas that we just touched on. So what do you guys think? Okay, so the audience is waiting for more to be done. So either the pharma and biotech is not doing enough, or they're getting started but more to do. So Bosch, do you agree? How has the interest in real world data and outcomes impacted launch plans and either helped or challenged pharma's success in that space?
Yes, I do agree with the results. I think when you kind of look at the recent launches, it's still very much a regulatory-driven sort of outcomes model. Interaction with payers and with data systems often are kind of done to characterize the burden of the illness, but looking forward, how you would capture the value of the medicine, planning for that further ahead during the time of the development. It's happening now, but it's not quite there. And I think if I look at opportunities where it's coming up, but slowly, but that definitely has to happen, is really in the area of gene therapy. Surya touched upon Zolgensma and Kymriah, and these are extremely expensive medicines, and there is a focused attention on the cost of the medicines, the affordability, system affordability, and the budget impact these medicines can have. And while these indications that the products are now approved for are still small, once we go into the 2025, 2030 timeframe, we could potentially have a number of gene therapies that are going to become available. And they're going to be wonderful, life-changing for the patients who are suffering from these conditions, because many of them have rare cancers or inherited diseases, but they are going to be expensive. So I think what needs to really change is these in bringing these innovative payment models or pay for performance, risk poolings. We have to leverage real-world data approaches to identify the natural progression of the disease. We have to kind of figure out how we want to capture outcomes that are meaningful to payers and providers. How are we going to go into financial sort of risk sharing, and who's going to be, where is that platform? Because the data source may not be in one place, it'll be in multiple places. So we've got to use technology and platforms to set up the data. And then we would be able to kind of align on how we measure the effectiveness of the product. And that takes a lot of work. That takes significant investment. It requires people with, as we talked about, incentives, maybe not the same incentives, but coming together, but investing together on what is going to help in the success of these products. Because if we don't do that, there are lots of expensive therapies that pharma is investing in that may not be successful, and that requires the planning today.
And you're talking about, gene therapies. There's a question here around how do you link drug development with appropriate medication use processes? So in other words, the process around finding the right patients for that therapy. So if you take a step out of gene therapies where it's very explicit who the target patient population is, how do you actually use data better to understand that the prescriber can understand, is this the right medicine for exactly this patient?
Definitely, and I think Callum touched upon that, and that's really going more into subgroups and subpopulations and a little bit more on personalized medicines and understanding the patient population, the disease much better. Natural history studies are a good way of understanding, at the population level and the subgroup level. And then alongside the drug development process, I think we also have to use provider level data, because sometimes claims data is going to have some endpoints, but some are EMR, but registries, provider data is really the source of being able to architect and design, which population is going to benefit the most. And we do need to, it's okay to kind of go for a narrow patient population and be either standing behind the value of the medicine for the narrow patient population versus go broad. I think the old internal medicine type of approach has become more blunt, and it needs to be more targeted towards the patients that are likely to benefit. And then, I think our value models, our cost sharing models need to be based on the parameters of the patient population that's going to benefit. And as a result, in order to do that correctly, again, the work needs to begin earlier during the drug development process, setting up, looking at, data sets like Callum has, for example, in the cardiovascular world and other centers of excellence, and bringing together the different, stakeholders. We don't do that in a uniform way all the time. And, relying on our technology partners to bring data sets from different sources together so we can kind of really study the disease area much more broadly. We can understand the nuances, and we can see what the treatment effect is most likely going to be.
Yeah, and there are a couple of people that have just asked questions about EHR data, so EHR integrated recommendations, as well as remote medication management. So, how do you remotely monitor compliance and health outcomes to keep people on drugs? So Callum, I'd like to ask that to you. You've been working on this in the cardiovascular space. What are you seeing as the types of data sources that are most useful, and how do you leverage remote data as well?
So I think those are really excellent questions, and as Bash outlined, I think one of the things you're starting to see is, for example, even in conditions like SMA, as we talked about, where gene therapies are being deployed, that there aren't enough people to make implementation in the clinical trial a separate, a totally separate endeavor. But I think that applies quite broadly when you start to look at even common cardiovascular diseases or diabetes or many of the other chronic disease entities that we see. So I do believe there's real opportunity both with remote care and also with much better digital data capture to begin to think about building end-to-end solutions. And without the right information, you can't match even the therapy plus the ability to accept that therapy with the patient who needs the intervention. And so we're starting to see care and discovery really come together much more seamlessly. I think some practical, I noticed a couple of the questions where, what are the online, where what were the practical ways in which this can be done? So for example, as you know, Manisha, we've built remote implementation programs for standard of care. And in that setting, the data capture can be at regulatory level. You can introduce a new drug without the sort of on-off infrastructure of a large CRO and test formally at relatively low cost in a purely randomized fashion, a completely new molecular entity. Obviously that at the moment is being done mainly for drugs that have already had pivotal phase 3 studies documenting safety and efficacy. But in the long run, I see that as evolving, an evolving part of a much richer data universe and thinking about how you start to incorporate social determinants of health and other aspects into the actual entire end-to-end solution for the patient. I think.
So you mentioned the catch there, though, that is that you're able to do it at lower cost, but for areas where safety and efficacy have already been demonstrated. The flip side to that, people say as well, when we're using those kinds of technologies, like let's say watches and other ways of collecting information about patients, how dirty is that data? Is it good enough? And will payers and others accept it, right? Because and Surya, also curious to hear your thoughts there from looking at the other side when you're actually looking at cost effectiveness. How good does the data need to be? And when we're broadening our sources of real world data, does the bar need to change for what we deem as appropriate from a payer and a clinical perspective? Yeah. Surya, how did you think about it at ICER?
I think you bring up a couple great points there that, just to unpack it a little bit, that there's the quality of the data that's being captured and accumulated, right? And so if you kind of look at the way we've traditionally done health technology assessment in this country, the payers have been left to their own devices. So we use administrative claims because that's what we have access to, right? And so we do that assessment, and then the developers and really anybody who is on the other side of the negotiating table don't like it because that health technology assessment and what we think we should pay was done within our four walls with data that we either bought access to or had from our own populations. But you're trying to do, sort of the analysis on data that you can vouch for the quality or lack of quality for, right? So you start bringing all these other data sources, as you kind of allude to, and not just wearables, and it even applies to clinical data from EHRs. The source is really important. How it's linked is really important, whether or not it's linked correctly in union to the administrative claims data, and social determinants, sort of the same way. But I totally agree with Callum's point that is, to me, part of the present and really where we're going in hopefully the near and midterm future, that we have a much richer overall profile, if you will, sort of universe of data and metadata on patients who have received the therapies, especially when you get to these really small populations. We need to understand what is it that's happening to them when they leave the initial period when we're doing really close monitoring, and what are all the other factors that may play into whether or not we call that therapy durable, if it's a single use therapy in particular in the cell and gene world, or if it's a potentially broader use treatment that is initially indicated for a subpopulation. And that's where I think FDA's recent work and the guidance they released on real world evidence and its use is really important. We haven't yet seen, though, enough real integration into initial applications for new drugs and for and a real concrete plan out of the development side of the ecosystem to how they're going to sort of accumulate and use real world evidence. So just like everything else, there can be really good plans and there can be a lack of plans, and then sort of a retrospective trying to get whatever we can get our hands on. And I think people really then sort of worry about the integrity of it, to your point. And so it's not, to me, it's not so much about just the source. Those are really important things to unpack and talk about too, wearable data and so on. But was it prospectively planned? When did we think that this was going to be a good idea to track? What were we going to use it for? Is this going to be used for the supplemental indication that we knew was coming, that was already, in perhaps maybe not directly in the public launch plan, but something that was already being looked at in smaller trials? And so to supplement that with real world evidence, have a plan to do so, I think is really important. I guess the last thing I'll say is just, I've always thought it's a little backwards that at the time that the drug is launched, and this continues to be the case in my former role at CVS and now on a bunch of different things that I'm working on, that we have the best possible, and now we have a third party, and we talked about at the beginning, or you said in the introduction, that I work with ICER. For this country, we don't have a government agency that does HTA. That doesn't really exist. So a third party nonprofit has emerged to do this work and provide a benchmark and a reference point for us. I think it's an incredibly important development, and I relied on it quite heavily in the work that I did at CVS. I know a lot of organizations I work with now do too. But they used the best possible information on patient benefit, right? And integrated into 2 units of benefit, ways of measuring it. You can argue with the quality adjusted life year, or you can use the equal value life year gained. But whatever it is that you're using, the goal, I think, is to integrate the best possible data from all these sources into that metric of how much do patients benefit. And we really need to be thinking about that at the time of launch, so that we establish a price that is, sort of based on value instead of based on prospective collection of new outcomes. That's my, sort of way of characterizing it.
And Vash, how are Pfizer and others thinking about third parties like an ICER in order to set a standard for value and also for outcomes?
So I think I agree with Surya that we need to shift from a volume-based healthcare system where we operate today to more of a value-based healthcare. I think currently the healthcare system overall is incentivized to pay more for number of pills. So the more number of pills that get dispensed, that get sold, the payer side makes profit through rebates, the pharma side makes a profit. It still doesn't take into account whether we have how many strokes did we prevent, how many patients will go into full remission if they're cancer patients, how many patients get an extension of life. And those are hard to do. Those require, again, an investment of time, money, interest to kind of move away from financial incentives to actually, incentives that are meaningful to patients and could help save costs. ICER, we are, pleased to announce that Pfizer just recently joined the ICER leadership team. I think they've made some great headways in this area, looking into, defining, what could be cost effective. I think where I probably wouldn't mind just kind of getting into debate is, again, quality adjusted life years is the best we got, but it's not the best. And there are many disease areas, like where I work in orphan disease, I work in ATTR-CM, which is an elderly patient population. Those patients just may have 5 years or 10 years at most of life to live, and a quality adjusted life years is just not enough for them to, is not the right metric. But having said that, that's a start. And we need to work together to find other measures of value. I think ICER has begun to bring the patient voice into the decision making. I think just a more closer and a more transparent partnership on how we define value, and a multidimensional approach is what we would need versus just a cost per quality type of a number. And the threshold, again, the US is not set up for the threshold. It's still a payment model which relies on, on some financial incentives. It has worked well in HTA markets that were set up about 20 years ago, but again, those thresholds have not changed over the past 20, 25 years. And as we bring cures into the market, particularly, those flat thresholds have just become a problem in getting access into the hands of the patients.
So is quality good enough? Surya, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that Bosch said, and I think there are a lot of different takes, and we could spend an hour or more just talking about the ways that the quality can be constructed and all that kind of stuff. But without getting into that granular detail, I think one thing she said is really important that actually can contribute to people getting to between payers and drug developers anyway, getting to a greater degree of alignment on the unit of benefit. Even it may still remain the quality, but that thing is incorporation of the patient voice and patient perspective earlier in the trial process. I can't tell you how many times now I've read through the reports, thought about the trials that were conducted, and said, why didn't they look more carefully at what the patients were really paying attention to in terms of their overall benefit and quality of life as a secondary outcome? I'm not asking them to spend, an inordinate amount of money to collect new outcomes. Today, sort of with the, sort of wide variety of different apps and techniques for getting data from patients is not an extremely expensive proposition. I have to say, I'm still kind of disappointed. It's not specific to Pfizer at all. I'm just disappointed that we haven't made greater strides in making sure that patient voice is really captured. And there has been a lot of finger pointing on both sides, but I think that's a need that both sides have long recognized, and that would contribute to getting away from this, what's the right threshold, all this kind of debate. Let's get the patient, sort of real quality of life, overall benefit incorporated into however we're going to conduct the analysis. But you can't do the analysis if you don't have the patient benefit really measured.
That's right. And I think we're talking about value and outcomes. And so let's launch the poll that we have for the audience on that topic. So the question is, looking 5 years from today, how often to what extent do you think we're going to move towards more innovative pricing models where we actually pay for value or pay for outcomes? So your options are rarely, sometimes maybe for a few therapies, or actually, I would put most as majority. So the majority of launches will actually use some kind of metric for pricing that's not just volume based in the next 5 years. And as people answer this and we go back, I'm going to ask you, Surya, what is the difference between pay for value and pay for outcomes? And there's a question from the audience too that brings up the medtech perspective about this. So, in the medtech space, there's no need to show outcomes from an FDA perspective, but payers still want evidence of a value demonstration. So as we get the poll results, I'll turn that to you, Surya, to take it.
Yeah.
Okay, so the majority of folks are in the sometimes space, which is, for a few high cost therapies, will maybe move to a different form of pricing, but still the majority of folks think that the majority of launches will still be in our same pricing structure. So what do you think about that? And what's the difference between value and outcomes for you?
Well, I hope they're wrong. First of all, I hope our audience is wrong. But I do feel like that, though, that the odds are with them, right? We're probably not going to move away for the majority of new drugs that are launched to either pay for value or pay for outcomes. And just to draw it again, I started to talk about this before, but just to take that head on and draw the distinction the way that I think about it. Pay for value, and again, I'm going to sidestep the value definition that Bosch alluded to before. I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, but the way I think about it, without getting into the definitional issues, is that value can be established and measured and studied and evaluated using all the data that has been accumulated at the time of the drug's launch. And again, to our earlier discussion that both Callum and Bosch touched on extensively, that can include real-world data and real-world evidence generated from that data. And so the value that we're paying for, that the payer is paying for, and the patient increasingly, to the copay and coinsurance point before that Bosch made, is paying for, can incorporate all of those different sources. To me, that's all, to put one kind of blanket term on it, it's a summation. It's retrospective data that's been collected, and we established what we think the current value is that we understand and has been demonstrated, and rolled it into an analysis, and we can, again, debate the right metrics and so on, and rolled it into a health technology assessment and do an analysis and establish a payment based on that. Pay for outcome incorporates what we know about the outcomes, but the way we've started to use it, it really is prospective. It's looking forward, whether you're going to measure the outcomes at a population level, and then there are these very spotty examples of people trying to measure at a patient level. But for the most part, we talk about contracting and paying for outcomes, it's at the population level. But that's really outcomes that are going to be demonstrated, which is where the difficulty comes in. When we write a contract between a payer and a life sciences company, then you have to adjudicate it. And that's where this whole issue of how the data gets collected and so on. So I draw a distinction between those two. I think we can absolutely move to more pay for value. I still continue to have struggles myself with, establishing the right amount of granularity and what you put on paper for pay for outcomes.
And also there, you brought up the short-term versus long-term. You brought up retrospective versus prospective. There's a question here that someone just asked about, well, that makes sense, but payers are still motivated to avoid approvals of new high-cost drugs that have long-term value or long-term outcomes. So if there isn't an immediate ROI, there's less incentive to move towards that kind of contract, and that's a barrier for the adoption of value or outcomes-based pricing. So what's being done to force payers, is the question says, either through patient advocacy or otherwise, to be more active, especially in rare diseases? So I'll ask Bosch that, since the question mentions rare diseases, but would like to turn it to others as well afterwards.
Yeah, sure. And I would agree. I think, again, the budgetary cycle for most payers is short term, right? So, and in many diseases, especially rare diseases, and if you're looking at gene and cell therapies, the durability of effect is going to be the most uncertain factor. We will have a certain amount of durability from the trial, but when you're looking in the $1 million+ therapies, I think patients, payers all want to kind of see a longer term durability of effect. And in order to capture that, you've got to follow these patients longer term. And our initial insights with payers has been mostly that those are an administrative burden. Those are hard to do. And it's easier just to kind of, give us a rebate, or we look at a short-term period. That, Kymriah has done that, looking over at a short-term period, and do that for diseases like DMD and hemophilia and others, where you can kind of look at certain outcomes over a 1 to 2 year period. And that, as Surya said, that becomes hard to do. It becomes hard to contract in. And at the same time, there is also a reluctance then to pay a high price or for the patient population that's going to benefit. So we are at a crossroads, honestly, where we have to kind of set up these systems where we find a middle ground on what is the durability of effect that we are signing up for, and set up payment models. The other factor, Manisha, is also portability, right? We have in the commercial side patients that keep changing plans. And so we also, and that's a big burden. And so, if you're looking at claims data sets to capture the the journey and how the patient does, it'll get lost if you're looking at just an insurance claims data. So it's
yes, as we're working with, Clarify is working with Pfizer on that exact problem, right? Looking at the longitudinality of the patient journey, even when we're moving between plans. So absolutely, yes.
Right, yeah, and I think that's something we have to solve. And when we do, I think we would probably come to more of an understanding of how we can kind of look at longer term outcomes. But what is long term is it's not years and years. I think that's again becomes as new drugs come to the marketplace, priorities change. And so it's got to be something that's reasonable to both parties.
Callum, what are your thoughts on this kind of the types of value and outcomes, pressure points or evidence points in the short term versus long term that needs to be demonstrated?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, as both Bash and Siri have said, this is a sort of thorny problem, particularly in the context of the way in which the majority of U.S. healthcare is funded. But I think if you look at it from the standpoint, as you pointed out a minute ago, Manisha, of the patient's journey, I think there really is a recognition that these are actually false distinctions, that we have to be able to really balance all of the components in a much more multidimensional fashion. And in fact, even the regulators are beginning to recognize that quality of life may only, at the moment, can only come after outcomes have been proven to be affected. And in many instances, as a result of that, drugs take much longer and much more expensive to develop before they actually get to the point where their uptake is more uniform. And so rethinking the entire development, trials, implementations life cycle, I think begins to allow you to start to put value in very different frameworks so that it could actually be early on be quality and only later on be outcomes. And everybody could be participating in defining that in real time. And it's a matter of what data you collect, how you collect it, how rigorously each of those points is validated. But ultimately, in every other industry in our lives, these problems have been overcome. Healthcare is almost unique in the sense that we use only a very small number of metrics and semi-subjective reports of secondhand information as the endpoints in everything that we do. Again, it's one of the reasons that the life cycle for innovation is about 20 years instead of 20 months. And the fact that we're not thinking about this as a data problem, I believe is going to come back and haunt us in the short term, but in the long run, it's going to revolutionize how healthcare advances are made, how innovation is translated. And also it'll reallocate, I think, a lot of the pain points in very different ways, as well as potentially also reallocating where the costs are. I mean, I think one of the things that always has amazed me is how much money is spent before a single patient actually gets a drug in actual clinical practice as opposed to within a clinical trial. And still there's a couple of $100 million a year on sales. And that type of process cannot be cost effective. And you can see it even in the way in which drugs are done, where only 1 in 11 trials, drug trials are done, only 1 in 11 trials is positive because everything is a fixed time point Hail Mary rather than an evolving process driven by data.
Right. And so now you touch on something that was our next topic, which is the sales and marketing model. And so is the traditional sales and marketing model of pharma dead? Going door to door to physicians and knocking on their doors. And, a number of people are upvoting a question around direct to consumer targeting of patients. So there are a number of commercials that target the patient. Obviously that increased sales and marketing costs from a pharma perspective. But if we're talking about using real world data and, the provider really being selective in choosing the type of patient, what role do the, both commercials, but also current traditional sales and marketing tactics have in this future world we're talking about? Bash, I'll ask you that first.
Sure. I won't say the pharma sales and marketing model is dead. I think the door-to-door, especially in the COVID-19 world that we live today, it's changed. It's become a permanent reality that we have to change the way we interact with our customers. We've already seen a big change even pre-COVID to digital, and because physicians are, they're extremely busy. They don't have time. They have their own administrative burden to deal with the hospitals and the practices. So I think our responsibility as pharma is to make sure that we we partner with them more on the education side. We put more medical affairs people on the ground. We bring more awareness around disease management, disease algorithms, use of AI and ads to identify hard to diagnose diseases. And we're doing that with TTRCM as we launch Vyndaqel into the market. And that also helps to reduce any kind of wastage and inefficiencies that happen when patients are not diagnosed appropriately. I think it's going to exist in some form, but I think the piece around removing the barriers that the providers face as they treat patients, which is really to do with insurance and access and hub services, that's the area that pharma needs to partner better with and provide them with solutions and tools and tips so that they can do the job better.
Thoughts from Callum?
So I agree.
What are you saying as a physician on the receiving end?
I think Bash is completely right. I think we're seeing an evolution of the process. I think we see it evolving even further. I can imagine if you think about a lot of the sales process at the moment, it's actually data transfer, something that in any other setting is happening immediately and virtually rather than face-to-face. And so I think those types of advances are going to have already hit drug sales very, very dramatically, the sales process very dramatically in the last couple of years, and I only see it accelerating. I also think it will hopefully begin to condense the implementation cycle. I think as information flows to all the stakeholders, to patients, physicians, IDNs, people will begin to recognize that at the moment, all of the barriers really are information content barriers. And as those are broken down, I think we'll hopefully see medicine evolve into a much more data-driven rather than opinion-driven field. And hopefully that will only help situations where the evidence gathering and knowledge generation and then knowledge implementation are part of the process.
So it sounds like none of you are fans of the TV commercials, more of a targeted approach to data sharing.
I don't have anything against direct-to-consumer, but I think it's having the right information flow at the right time to the right people, and then having everybody act on a shared reality.
I'm happy to say, I obviously respect everything Callum has to say, but I'm happy to say I'm not a fan of the TV commercials, because the funds that are used for that, there was a question on the Q&A about more sophisticated clinical decision support. Let's fund more sophisticated clinical decision support as we're dealing with being able to identify the subpopulation and really move to a more data-driven universe. You know, it's still a world of limited resources. And in that world, I'd like to see our limited dollars spent on things that are going to help us identify the right patient for the right drug.
Yeah. Okay, so there are a lot of questions coming up around what should pharma do differently, you know, what are the approaches? And so let's move into that. We have a poll question there to get a sense from the audience. So, you know, if you are going to place your chips of the following areas, and we touched on a lot of these, where should make the biggest investment to improve the success of drug launches? Sales and marketing, using real world data in different ways, really changing the way we're looking at pricing. We talked about patient, and then the last ones are on market dynamics and competitor behavior from an analytics perspective. So I know we've touched on all of these as having some kind of role. What's most important from the audience perspective? Let's see where they landed. Okay, so we have 35% of the audience is saying using more real world data pre and post launch, but we have split votes on pricing, on patient engagement, and a bit on sales and marketing as well. So to turn it to Bosch, and I'll ask all of you this, and this is part of the question, what do you think pharma should change from a go-to-market model to achieve better first-year uptake? And then the second part of that is around the data piece, which is, you know, looking at a standard journey for pharma company, looking at the molecule journey, the HCP journey, the patient journey. How are those journeys going to become more integrated and collaborative in the future? So if you could answer both the go-to-market, but also the how do you put together the payer, HCP, and patient piece of them in a successful pharma launch strategy.
Sure. The go-to-market, Manisha, has got to change, much before even your phase 3 trial reads out. I think even as you're planning your phase 3 trials, there needs to be a multi-stakeholder engagement on what's not just important to the physician treating the patient, but what's important to the patients themselves. And those elements need to be captured as part of either the phase 3 program or alongside through some kind of a real-world data mechanism. And the scouting for those data systems, whether it's EMR or whether it's multiple claims, and we've talked with Clarify Health about building that data architecture, the infrastructure. It does not exist today, and how we bring that partnership with whether it's advocacy groups, different payers who may be competing with one another, but bring them all together and bring this element of trust, because that's how you kind of bring that joint ownership and multiple stakeholders and build these functions. We go beyond just a pill offering. We are offering something that's meaningful to the patient, that's going to be hopefully captured in the trial itself and then post-trial. So I think that's part of almost our 3-year, we call it launch -3 type of timelines, or even sometimes launch -4, and that's when we begin the dialogue and we sort of build it through, and the real world evidence platform becomes part of an ongoing journey that we build as the clinical trial is developing. And then once the trial reads out, I think that's when you begin to engage with payers much earlier than launch. Don't go 6 months prior to launch, but and then the price is a piece of the conversation, but the value, how you've arrived at the value, and the insights that you've taken from the payers as we build the evidence is important to kind of describe the value. So that I think has to become the go-to-market model. And then how we work with the different customer groups, I think as I touched upon, the providers are, and as I see mostly in the cardiology world, but I think it's in many areas, I think in RA and others, it's become better supported. But there's a lot of administrative burden on them with just, again, making sure that they jump through hoops, get check the patient's book, the insurance, the eligibility of the patient. There are patient assistance programs, and those become more of if you follow the traditional model of reimbursement, they become not just wasted resources, in some ways a waste of time. And so and I'm being a little bit probably utopian as I say this, but as we look at new therapies, new areas where we could put in value-based agreements, where it's not just an X% rebate we give, and the physician therefore has to kind of go through the formulary and say which one's on the formulary or not. There are actual agreements in place around, okay, this medicine is going to work in this patient population. We have an agreement, and there's a mechanism to collect the data, and I'll be a contributor to the data. I mean, that's almost a little bit utopian as I say this, but that's where we kind of need to go to, because without that, we'll be looking at inefficiencies and a lot of costs that unfortunately just kind of they go unnoticed because they don't necessarily get collected in the total cost of care.
Yeah, and the audience is asking, how do you initiate co-creation? Everything you're talking about is working with different groups. How do you actually have a co-creation process? I mean, we're at time, but maybe I'll end with a lightning round, which is if you were going to give one piece of advice to the pharma and biotech industry around maximizing launch success, what would you say? And I'll go around. I'll start with Surya, and then we can hand it back over to the health team.
Okay, I'll make it one, but it has 2 prongs. So, but it's a lightning round. We agree. But Basha, I love what you said about having the real-world evidence plan be part of the process and planned ahead of time and shared with payers, because I think that sets you up and sets developers up for being able to have a much more collaborative conversation about what the value really is, and if it can't be measured, in all different facets that the payers want at the time that the drug is launched, at least we have a plan for how it will be measured over time, and we can really understand what the value is. So, so that's my piece of advice: is that more companies have that really kind of comprehensive go-forward plan that extends well beyond the launch for how real-world data and evidence can be used.
Callum?
I would just echo what Bash and Surya had said, that ultimately this is, as we've talked about, trust amongst all the partners, and a shared objective reality is an important piece of that trust. So comprehensive data is really the start of co-creation.
Bash? Manisha, I think it's already happening, and we have technology-backed companies that can help co-create. And if Surya was in CVS today, and if Surya, Callum, and I, and Pfizer were to work together, we would get one set of data. But if you look at the US population, we would need multiple such collaborations happening. And in order to do that, there are technology platforms, there are data platforms that are allowing for sharing of what we call a distributed data network. And I think that's the direction we need to go in and build this trust between and amongst providers, between payers, between different parties as well. And I think it's just, again, I won't say we are scratching the surface. I think it's already happening. Well, there's so many good questions, and going into so many details of what we've been talking about. And I'll hand it back to Health, but there will be some follow-up as well, so that we can touch on some of these topics. But I want to thank you to Callum, Surya, and Vash for taking the time today and having this discussion. There are lots of critical questions going forward, and we really appreciate it. So I'll hand it back over to the Health team for the post-event.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manisha, and to all of our panelists. If you'd like to join us in continuing the conversation, please join us on our LinkedIn. And now I'd like to introduce our chef for today, Jennifer Clare.
Hello, everyone. How are you? I'm Jennifer Clare. I'm not sure if I have two cameras going here, and I would love the other camera to be turned on. So if you give me a sec, because I want you to be able to see my cutting board. And you can, great. So my name is Jennifer Clare. I'm the owner of Home Cooking New York. We're a cooking school in New York City. And obviously our brick and mortar school is closed right now. But we have launched a whole online cooking program, classes for kids, classes for adults. We have about 6 different public classes a week of all different varieties, because we find a lot of people are spending time in their home kitchens in a way that they have not in the past, not eating out so much, not doing seamless as much if you're a New Yorker. So this is a great time to learn how to cook for yourself in your own home kitchen. So our classes have become very popular all of a sudden, because we now have a national, international audience. So I was asked to join you just to give you a very quick 15-minute pantry staple meal. So we're going to be making a chickpea puttanesca. This is one of the most popular meals to make for sort of the quarantine time, because everything can be sourced from your pantry. Most of the things that we're using today are things that are shelf stable. You'll never even have to go out to a grocery store if you decide you want to cook. So thank you for inviting me, and I am delighted that you're here. So I often, as a teacher, like to take questions. Unfortunately, I'm not able to do that because I'm doing this for so many of you and only in 15 minutes. But if you ever have questions for me, my contact information is at the bottom of the recipe that you're going to be sent by the meeting administrators. And anyways, our school is Home Cooking New York, and our website is homecookingny.com. You can check out our public cooking classes that happen every night at 5:30, sometimes on weekends as well. If you're interested in upping your game, Moroccan cooking, Persian cooking, bagels. We're doing a pita workshop. We're doing a boot camp for adults, doing fish techniques, anything you can imagine. Anyways, so we're going to be doing a chickpea puttanesca. This is a very classic, just in case I'm not sure what you can see, but I have two cameras set up, my face, if you want to look at that. And then there's also my cutting board, so you can see some cutting techniques. And also when I start cooking, seeing what I have in my pan. So puttanesca is a classic Italian sauce. And it is made with extremely fragrant ingredients. So this is not a very, it's like a marinara sauce on steroids. So in addition to having tomatoes in it, a very classic sort of tomato-based Italian sauce, it's going to hold a whole host of very, very powerfully flavored ingredients. That's why it is such a great dish to make on the fly. The more not exotic, that's a terrible word, but the more flavorful and pronounced the ingredients that you use in a dish, the less you have to cook them. So we're using things like crushed red pepper flakes and anchovies and olives and capers and red wine. All of these ingredients have so much flavor of their own that it doesn't require a long amount of cooking time to develop flavor. So cooking does develop flavor, but when you're using ingredients that are already powered by flavor, the cooking process can be much more shortened. So this is only a 15-minute sauce, hence the reason I chose it for this this webinar, because I only had 15 minutes to do it. So we are going to start by getting the base of our sauce ready. So we're going to slice up some onions, and I'm going to crush some garlic, and I'm going to cook that in a pan with some olive oil, a couple of whole anchovy fillets that will melt into the oil, and some crushed red pepper flakes. That will be the base of our sauce. And then when we are, when those are all sauteed and delicious and fragrant after about 3 minutes, we're going to add all the rest of our ingredients, which is going to be a can of tomatoes, it's going to be some red wine, it's going to be some olives, and some capers. So I'm starting by dicing up just a regular old yellow onion. Now, this is an aromatic ingredient, meaning you can use any aromatic ingredient you want. You can use a leek, you can use a shallot, you can use scallions. Those are all in the onion family, and they all give you that wonderful pungency. When I cut an onion, I just want to point out, I keep the root end attached at the back. Makes it much easier to cut the onion when it is in one piece. So I'm cutting the onion in sort of stripes before I cut it across in a checkerboard fashion. By not cutting off the back of the onion, I'm able to keep this in one piece. It's just so much easier to work with. I have an onion, it's still in one piece, and then when I turned it 90 degrees and I slice across, much easier to hold on to. All right, so we've got our onions cut up. I'm gonna go over to my pan and heat it up. I'm gonna take you with me, and we're going to turn on the stove. And I'm gonna start by putting in about 2 tablespoons of olive oil. Actually, I'm gonna put 3. I like to coat the whole bottom of my pan. And because this is a puttanesca sauce and the ingredients, I'm bringing you back because I'm cutting up the garlic. The ingredients have no fat of their own. I don't have any proteins in here with a lot of fat, or add any fat at all. I'm using chickpeas. So you're gonna have to add fat to your pan. That's the only places you can have fat. So when you're building flavor for food, salt, fat, and acid are 3 really important flavor profiles. In order to make a food taste as best as it can, it must have an acid, it must have salt, and it must have fat. If it's missing one of those ingredients, you're gonna tend to have food that doesn't have as much flavor as it could. And we're gonna get to that because puttanesca sauce is a perfect example of a salt, fat, acid trio in terms of having the powerful ingredients that have all of those flavor bases. That's why the sauce is so good. So anyways, I'm gonna just show you how you're gonna crush a garlic clove. If you want a garlic clove that doesn't have the skin, to take the skin off much more easily than peeling it by hand, you're gonna take your knife, lay it over the garlic clove, smash it, and that loosens the skin. And so it's much easier to peel it off of the garlic. So you can peel it off in one piece, just like that, and you're left with your garlic clove. And we'll do that with the other one. All right. Now, when I'm working with garlic, I tend to remove this little woody tip at the bottom, if you can see, of my garlic clove. Just a little bit of like a wood texture, barky. So I want to cut that off. So I just have the soft white clove. And then I'm just going to mince that up. Now, when you're cooking with garlic, you don't want to chop your garlic too small, because as you all know, if you chop up your garlic too small and you put it into a hot pan of oil, what happens? It burns, it browns. So the smaller you chop your garlic, the more quickly it's going to brown. Therefore, you never use a garlic press when you are cooking with garlic. A garlic press is for garlic that you use raw. You put it in a salad dressing, a marinade, fine. But do not press garlic and then put it into a hot oil pan, or you will find that it will turn brown very, very quickly. So I'm bringing you over to my stove, and we're going to start cooking our puttanesca. Okay? So we're going to start by putting our onions in the pan. And our garlic. And we're going to stir those up. And we're going to cook these for about 3 minutes until they soften. They get translucent. That's the term that you use for onions when you're cooking them. You always want to cook them for about 3 minutes alone in the pan, because that's going to give you the sweet onion flavor and not the raw onion flavor. You never throw raw onions into a simmering pot of tomatoes, ever. You always cook them to get out their bitter juices, so they sweeten up, and then all of a sudden the flavor that you love about onions is present. All right, so in addition to our onions and our onions and garlic that are in the pan, I'm gonna put in a pretty generous pinch, about a 1/4 teaspoon of crushed red pepper flakes. That's gonna give us our heat for this sauce, because this puttanesca is not only flavorful with olives and capers and wine, it's also got some nice heat to it. And then our 4th ingredient that's going in are gonna be anchovies. Now, when you're working with anchovies, the nice thing is that you can add anchovies whole. You do not have to cut up anchovies when you're cooking with them. You just take the whole anchovy, just like I am doing. I'm doing 2 because I love anchovies. You could even do up to 3. The nice thing about anchovies is when they heat up, they break down. So these anchovies, without my having to touch them, are going to dissolve into the oil in the pan. So that's why I add them right now. The heat in the pan is much more pronounced when there's hot oil in the pan. So if you can already see, my anchovies are turning into an anchovy paste already. So if I were to add the anchovies once I had the tomatoes in the pan, they wouldn't cook down as easily because the heat of boiled tomatoes is not as hot oil. So tomatoes are a liquid. So they can only get up to 212 degrees. 212 degrees is the boiling point. That's the hottest a liquid can get in the kitchen. So in order to give you the most heat, you're going to add it to the hot oil stage, because hot oil can get much hotter than a liquid. So I wanted to point that out because when you are trying to bring out the flavor of certain foods, spices for one of them, if you do any kind of Indian cooking, you know that you always fry your spices, you bloom them in hot oil. That's because it helps their flavor become more pronounced. Same is true with this. We're using crushed red pepper flakes. That's a spice. It's helping bloom its flavor. And then it's also helping melt down our anchovies. So if you can see into my pan, you can see nary a piece of anchovy, which is good for many people because a lot of people don't like anchovies, or they claim they don't like anchovies. The truth of the matter is most people love the flavor of anchovies if it's hidden in a dish, but if you point it out, they say, oh, it tastes too fishy. But the proper use of anchovies is not using too many that the fishy flavor comes out. What you're looking for is that rich, salty intensity that you cannot get from salt alone. All right, so my onions are done. I've got onions, crushed red pepper flakes, garlic, and melted anchovies. So now it's time to add all the rest of our ingredients. So we're gonna start with, our first ingredient is gonna be wine. When you're cooking with wine, we're gonna use about 1/2 cup of red wine. And this is any old red wine you have. This is a bottle of wine I opened up about 3 weeks ago. I decided I didn't like it so much, so I just put a cork on it and it sits on my, in my kitchen, and I use it for cooking. It can be, because wine is not good for drinking, obviously, after 3 weeks after it's open, but it's fine for cooking. That's because it gets very, very acidic. The sugars start to break down and it becomes a very rough flavor. But for cooking, it's fantastic. You want the bright acidity that wine gives you. So we're adding the wine to the pan first because it helps boil off the alcohol. So by putting it in the hot pan, before we add any other liquids, it will boil off the alcohol more quickly. And it leaves behind that great, jammy, sort of acidic but fruity flavor. All right, so we've got our wine. Now go in our chopped tomatoes. I just have a 28-ounce can of chopped tomatoes. I've got 3 tablespoons of capers. And I've got some olives that I completely forgot to chop up before you joined me. So I'm going to do a rough chop, and then I'm going to add them in. So now that we have all the ingredients in the pan, all we need to do is cook this uncovered for about 10 minutes to let all the flavors come together. Now, you're not going to sit here and watch me cook all of this for 10 minutes, but the reason that you cook it with the lid off is because there's a lot of water in the tomatoes. So if you cook off the water in the tomatoes, what you're doing is essentially concentrating the flavor of the sauce. When you remove water from something, it makes it more flavorful. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to remove the water content from this can of tomatoes, because it's really the only thing with the liquid content in it. The olives, the capers, the onions have already had all their water cooked out. You're just trying to thicken the sauce to enrich it. The sauce already tastes delicious. Sorry, I lost my camera and I don't know why. Let's see if I can get you back. I'm sorry about that. I'm gonna take my webcam over here. so you can see my sauce. There you go. Actually, it looks better on the webcam, doesn't it? Okay, so what we're going to add to this is going to be our chickpeas. So for the tomato sauce, I apologize that I have to do this by hand. Let's see if I can hook it on here. There we go. All right, so we're going to add chickpeas to this. You can add any protein that you like to a puttanesca sauce. So some of the examples are chickpeas, white beans are also really great. You can add raw chicken and let it simmer in the tomato sauce and have that be the cooking method for the meat. You can put raw meat in here, so you can put pork tenderloin, salmon. You can put raw shrimp in here, and you can just put it into the puttanesca sauce, put a lid on it, and then the puttanesca sauce, while it's cooking, is also cooking the protein in it. So for a perfect pantry meal, that's why I chose chickpeas, because chickpeas are already something that is fully cooked. It's a great protein source. It makes for a good vegetarian meal. This is also vegan. But so it is a standalone sauce, the puttanesca, but the nice thing about it is that it's also something that you can use to cook other food in. So that's why it's one of the most perfect sauces. So I'm going to add, I would cook it for a little bit longer, but I want you to see a finished dish. So I'm going to add some pasta to it, because that's going to make my dish complete. You can also put cooked farro in here. You can put it over, you can also put it over things. So you can put it over polenta, you can put it over cooked quinoa. And, oh, another thing I didn't mention that you can cook in puttanesca sauce are eggs. You can sort of poach eggs a la shakshuka, if anyone's ever had shakshuka. You make a puttanesca sauce, make some little holes in your sauce like here, crack an egg right into here and put a lid on it, and you'll poach the egg right into the sauce. And it's a pretty marvelous way of serving this puttanesca. Anyways, so that is our puttanesca. I will plate it up for you, and then I will turn you back over to your wonderful hosts. And hopefully I will see you in one of our classes if you're interested. If you have any questions about this recipe, I know that they're going to be sending it to you, and I hope that you will make it at home. All right. Bon appetit. Sorry we had to go to my webcam.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.